So in the last session, we spoke about the alphabetic acrostic form. And one of the things that I suggested was that you could think of it as a way of containing the uncontainable. And I want to think about, in terms of the content of Lamentations, how an effort to contain grief is almost a response to God's lack of containment of divine wrath. Because not containing divine wrath is what results in destruction and human suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a pretty consistent sense, less in chapter 3, which we'll get to. But certainly in the first couple of chapters and then chapter 4, there's really a sense of what's gone wrong here. Stepping back for a second, I read Lamentations as Israel admitting that we did something wrong, but that it shouldn't, the punishment went too far.
Yeah, I'm reminded of my toddler telling me, Mommy, I know I made a mistake, but why did you yell?
Right. This is like that, except much worse than yelling. But it's, it's a lot of like, yes, there's admissions. Yes, we sinned. But the descriptions of the wrath, the descriptions of the pouring out of the wrath, of the destruction, descriptions of, things like God has acted like the enemy, right? Like someone who doesn't care. Yeah. Those all seem to me to speak to that, exactly the notion you're talking about.
Well, I mean, so one explanation that's given for all of these horrors is that it is God's expression of divine justice. And one of the things that's striking about Lamentations through all of the imagery of the horrors is that divine justice is actually quite cold comfort in the face of human suffering. And so in that sense, it presents a really ambivalent message about what does it mean to, how just is divine justice, right? It's not Job. It's not the book of Job. So it's not taking this head on.
Yeah.
But though subtle, it's certainly there as a, bereaved mothers and starving children and mothers eating their own children, which is something we see in chapter 2. I mean, this paints a very disturbing picture of what divine justice is. And I think, sort of implicitly poses the question whether divine justice really is just.
Mm-hmm. I mean, almost maybe more than implicitly. I mean, I think it's simmering right below the surface at the very least. The other thing I would say is, certainly in chapters 1 and 2, that notion of divine justice or punishment or wrath is inextricable from the question of gender, right? Because Jerusalem is both figured as and speaks as a female character.
Yeah.
And so, and there is imagery that is, there's clearly rape imagery of the the foreigners invading the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. There's shaming. There's all of this that ties into a bigger metaphor. How do we grapple with all of that?
I mean, it's not, unfortunately, for those who have read, prophetic literature, this kind of imagery is not going to be surprising, though disturbing it is. Reading Hosea, reading Ezekiel, seeing how the image of Israel as a bride, right? And now we're no longer in the landscape, the fecund, loving landscape of Song of Songs. We are in the horrible aftermath of God rejecting Israel for all of her iniquities, for betraying God. I mean, this is it's a very bleak picture of domestic life. It's definitely abusive. God is, a narcissistic, abusive boyfriend certainly in those prophetic texts, and we see the aftermath here in Lamentations.
Yeah, and actually what makes Lamentations powerful in part is not just that, in the prophetic texts, it's like God talks about, especially Hosea 2, which is, it's an unbelievably terrible chapter, but it talks about stripping and shaming and publicly humiliating and all of these, and beating and all terrible things. But then there's the and then I'll bring you back. Right, which is itself abusive, obviously.
Right. I mean, this is like Renita Weems, this is very much the sort of cycle of abuse.
Right.
And it is, of course, disturbing to read in these texts that this is what characterizes God's relationship to Israel.
And so where Lamentations comes in is we don't get the and then I'll bring you back in love part. Like we've stopped and we're focusing on the abusive part, the punitive part, but we're getting it for the only time in the Bible from her perspective, right? From the perspective of what in Hebrew is Bat Zion or fair Zion. Like it's the personification of Jerusalem as widow, as daughter, as wife. I mean, all of those images are in the book, but we hear her speak.
Yes, it is unusual to hear. So, backing up a bit, in reading prophetic literature, when you hear about the destruction of cities, right? Or in these prophecies of doom, right? It's oftentimes presented from the perspective of onlookers who are sort of gleefully rejoicing over the destruction of the city. This is quite unusual because it is the voice responding to that destruction.
Yeah. But the voice also is talks to the onlookers, right? They're still there, but she says and she'll say, "Look at me, look and see how there is no pain like my pain."
Yeah.
Right. Which I've always read, I must admit, as a sort of a poke at the deity, right? The deity is the one who's supposed to be, right? They're supposed to be sneering, and he's supposed to be protecting, but he's the one who's caused the pain.
Yeah, I mean, it is really the image of on the background of this culture, an abandoned woman, right? She has been abandoned. She has been left without protection, without the sort of patriarchal protection that this, society affords through, the structures of the house of the father.
Yeah. And for all of that, the poem, for 2 chapters, I think, is entirely doing that. And then in chapter 3, it hits a sort of weird male brick wall, right? It is a female-voiced and female-led book for 2 chapters,
but not a human woman, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Just like in Proverbs, this is personified, a personified Jerusalem, personified Bat Zion, just like in Proverbs, a personified wisdom or personified folly. Not human woman who is speaking back.
But a female voice nonetheless.
Yes. And
then in chapter 3, the first words are, "I'm that dude." Ani hagever. I am the man. I find it actually, all I can think of right now is the Barbie movie, legitimately. But chapter 3 is when Ken discovers patriarchy.
And horses.
And horses.
Presumably.
getting off topic. But I mean, it is suddenly in chapter 3, which we talked about last time, is like it's central, it's longest, it's the re-emphasized acrostic.
It's the man-spreading of the entire book.
Right, man-spreading and mansplaining all at once. I hate this chapter. I hate it for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of the sudden intrusion in such a overtly domineering way. Like, I am the man to begin, and then it's like this is where it sounds like Jeremiah, like it's this self-pitying. I hate Jeremiah. A self-pitying stance that also contains in the middle of it this sudden turn towards like, and amid all of this destruction that I've suffered, I still have hope. Right? God is still good, and everything will still be okay. Which, again,
but you need it. So like this,
go ahead. Tell me why.
In defense of, I'm not defending it from a personal perspective, but like from the perspective of the kind of like, theological and aesthetic work that I think that Lamentations is doing in its current form in this structure, right? With having chapter 3 in the middle, with this like, each letter, gets 3 lines. I think that you can't just have the voice of Bat Zion. You can't just have the destruction. You have to have an appeal. This is an appeal, right? This is the only part that's forward-looking.
Except the very, very end.
Yeah.
Okay, but go ahead. We'll get to that in a second.
Like, there's, you need the appeal. One can argue that the third chapter is the central. I mean, like, if it is the most important part of it, and the most important part of it is not Jerusalem herself personified. It is, its inhabitants, really, right? It is Israel, and that's the man.
Yeah, but it's an individual, right? There's also, the chapter 4, I think, is like the collective one. It's like we, us, our, the city. This is like the one guy. I don't know, it doesn't bother you?
I don't take it really that personally.
I take it so personally, which is funny. But I don't know, okay, but we can move on. But you brought up like the hope aspect of it. So the very, very end of the book, the very last lines, like, and this is a reading tradition issue, right? In the original Hebrew text, like the next to last line is, Hashivenu, right? Like, return to us, O Lord, that we may return to you. And then the last line is, but you have turned, like, you have abandoned us.
Yeah,
like,
but that's the main paradox of the whole work.
But in Jewish reading, the last line is the hope line again. Return to us, right? Like it's like, and it was too bleak an ending. So the last, in the Jewish reading tradition, you end the book with the return to us, O Lord, line.
Yeah.
But that's a falsity to that.
Yeah. Well, the last chapter also is not like an orderly acrostic either. This was, to my point in the previous session, right? That grief is mixed up, right? And I think that, if we're going to talk about, historical compositional context, we can think about this being not, even though it seems like it's a report on the scene, it really is about trying to rationalize a return, through rationalizing what it would mean to return, even with all of this, like, human suffering.
Can you imagine it also as an attempt to rationalize, like, if we were to imagine this not in the wake of destruction, but as you suggested previously, like, in the moment of restoration, for it to be actually a coming to grips with how do we get back to God given everything that was done to us, but also what kind of posture do we need to have in order that, like, how do we make sense of the fact that we're going to act like nothing ever happened?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like the end of Lamentations, but